since Richard and I have quite different backgrounds in law and science, respectively, I thought I would share some thoughts of mine on this topic. So, before I go into the science side of things, I wanted to comment on Richard's point about the man who was executed and the public's reaction that he deserved the pain that happened when the execution went wrong. There was a study where people were shown footage supposedly of people receiving electric shocks. I believe there were actors kind of pretending in the videos. And then the psychologists who were doing the experiment asked the participants questions about what they thought about the person they saw in the video being electrocuted. And the responses, the kind of negative assessment of the character of the person being electrocuted increased as the severity of the shock increased in appearance in the video. So you have a situation here where if someone's really in pain, if something really unfortunate has happened to someone, you're more likely to think they're a bad person. Now, kind of logically, there's no evidence there that they're a bad person. So there's not a rational kind of decision-making process going on here in how you assess the person's character. But what there does seem to be is an emotional, kind of self-protective, anti-empathetic response, where in order perhaps to conserve your emotional resources, you see someone in pain and you say like, okay, I'm not going to care about them. They're probably awful. They probably deserve it. Which I think is really interesting and is really at the core of this issue of when we see someone who is deeply, deeply unfortunate, say they've been raised in poverty with multiple, things that might impact their life negatively. So there's addiction in their family and there's just everything's going wrong and there are these huge systemic problems. That's a big task if you're going to say that we need to save that person, right? You basically need to change all of the kind of unequal systems in society. So it's far easier just to say they probably deserve it, and that allows you to get on with your day. So I think this is part of the reason we make decisions to blame people as the cause of their behaviour rather than the actual causes. And so this comes down to if there's no free will, if it's really as simple as that. And this is why I like Richard's work, is it's very to the point and very kind of no nonsense, just saying there isn't free will, which I agree with. But then why do we think there's free will? Why are we even having this conversation if it's that straightforward? And I think it's because if you think of living systems, we're kind of relatively autonomous from our environment. Not entirely. We're still, as a kind of land mammal, I can only exist in this thin layer of oxygen, between space and the earth. This thin layer of atmosphere. Even if I go into the sea, suddenly I can't function as this system that's exchanging resources with the environment. So I'm a kind of feature of this niche, but I can move around the niche quite freely. The dynamics are such that I, as a living system, take on a level of autonomy. And this applies all the way down to kind of single cells, a rock in an avalanche that can, that when forces act on it, you can really see there's not much in the nature of the rock that's going to determine what happens. There's a little bit, it's mass perhaps, but with very simple physical equations, you can see the how it's acted upon and how it doesn't really make sense to say the rock that's being hit is the cause of its movement. You can really attribute it to the actual cause. But then with us, because we're this complex, self-creating, self-sustaining open system, there is, it makes sense to attribute our choices, to the organism, to this complex physical system. So if I, move towards a piece of food or another piece of food, it's right to attribute the causality to the relatively autonomous life form, rather than, like the analogy of a rock hitting me. But it doesn't change the fact that there's still a huge web of causality that leads me to decide whatever I'll decide. And so it's not that, people can resist the idea of non-existence of free will because they think it's that they're being kicked around by the physics of the universe. But it's more that you are the physics of the universe. It's happening through you. So you can still make choices in line with your nature, with what's best for you. You can still act rationally or in your own, self-interest, or you're not just randomly doing things. So there is choice, but it's just not this fairy tale version of absolute free choice where it kind of magically comes into existence at some point. There's this web of causality that's happening through you, and there's not any other magical ingredient. And I think we should be happy with that situation. I will choose what I will choose in line with my own nature and circumstances. And I think that's how it should be. I don't want to suddenly, as Richard said, you don't want to, if someone tells you they love you, you don't think it's down to some random quantum fluctuation that they don't really mean it. You want it to be signaling a truth about your circumstance and your relationship to this person. And so I want my choice of food to be based in my history of food preferences, what I think is nutritious. I don't want it to just be random and come out of this kind of magical free will. And I think if this doesn't sound like a kind of an appealing way of seeing the world, people often find in meditation that just observing the contents of consciousness, they realize that there is just this existence is just this kind of unfolding of things happening with there's nothing else. It's just this causal associative chain of an unfolding process. And when you settle into that and you drop the kind of the stress that goes along with wanting to control the world, which is really, free will comes out of the idea that the ego, the self, is this kind of puppeteer controlling everything. And it's the self that creates suffering. So if you let go of that, you can really be left with a very positive feeling about this lack of free will. And so I think with the deep attachment, it's always from this from the thinking the ego or the self is in control. And what comes to mind is this perspective of the self as a kind of PR agent for the organism, which I spoke about with Robert Wright. And in that perspective, as an organism, there's this bottom-up unfolding process, and then there's this psychological module, which is associated with language, that can spin a good story about what's happening with this organism. So I instinctively grab a banana because my blood sugar is low, happens entirely, without the conscious self noticing it. But then you turn to me and you say, "Why are you holding a banana in your hand?" I'll look at it and I'll know, because I'm a functioning system, I'll understand why you might be holding a banana for nutrition, but also the kind of social relationships and stuff. So I can tell a good story. I can say, "Oh, it's because I'm hungry," even though I haven't consciously. It wasn't that the self noticed the organism was hungry and then willed it to grab a banana. It grabbed the banana, asked about it, spun a good story, and it signals to the other person that you're a kind of functioning system.